Hey guys, tonight we step into the cold corridors of Richmond Palace, where candles flicker against moss-covered stone walls, and every gust of wind slipping through the cracks whispers a secret no one dares to speak aloud. Right here in this shadowed chamber, Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled for more than 4 glorious decades, from 1558 to 1603, now faces the final days of her life. And the question that has haunted both her court and history for centuries is this: what truly led to her death? Picture it, a proud queen, once feared across all of Europe, now standing motionless for hours, refusing food, refusing sleep, as if lying down would mean losing everything. Trust me, if you had to witness that scene with your own eyes, you probably wouldn't survive it, at least not in spirit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you live. I always love seeing our night owl map light up across the planet. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine this. When you step into Elizabeth's private chamber at Richmond Palace in the early months of 1603, the first thing you notice is not music or incense, but the chill that seeps through every layer of velvet. The candle on the long wooden table flickers, its flame trembling as if trying to reassure someone. But deep down, you know that no one in this room can find comfort, and right there, in the middle of it all, the aging Queen of England, once the woman who commanded all of Europe's gaze, stands motionless, refusing to sit, refusing to eat, and above all, refusing to sleep. You see, this is no longer the heroic Elizabeth at Tilbury, riding a horse in armor to rally her troops against the Spanish Armada. This is another Elizabeth, shoulders hunched, eyes distant, a shadow of gloom surrounding everyone in her presence. Contemporary records say she would stand for hours, eyes fixed on some invisible point along the stone wall. Her ladies-in-waiting trembled, unsure whether to comfort her or remain silent. A gentle touch might be pushed away, and even a question could draw a frown. The official historical account says that, in those final days, Elizabeth allowed almost no one into her chamber, except for a few close companions like Lady Scrope. That isolation fueled endless rumors. Some whispered she was haunted by the ghost of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Others claimed she had lost all will to rule. In truth, the way she avoided her bed said everything. She believed that if she lay down, death itself would be waiting. Strangely, and this is something few people know, she even rejected music. Remember, Elizabeth adored music. She sang, she played instruments, and her court was famous for its dazzling performances. Yet now, even the sound of strings made her turn away. Imagine it, like someone who once lived for pop music, but suddenly decided to switch off Spotify forever. That kind of change is as frightening as a warning bell. Historians still argue over what truly broke Elizabeth down. Some say it was simply age and illness. Others insist she sank into depression after Essex's execution. A few modern researchers even suggest the lead-based cosmetics she wore daily, the very paint that gave her porcelain white skin, slowly poisoned both her body and her mind. No one has ever reached a final answer, and perhaps it is this uncertainty that makes her final days so haunting. You could hear the slow footsteps of courtiers in the wooden halls, each echo carrying through the vast palace. They whispered that the queen no longer ate. Silver trays of untouched food were carried away cold. She grew so thin that her once glorious gowns, pride of the whole court, hung loosely on her body, like curtains concealing bone. And here's the darkly funny part. If social media had existed back then, the court physicians would probably have posted Elizabeth's diet plan fasting forever, with the hashtag not recommended. And of course, no one would have tried it. Yet even in refusal, there was politics. Elizabeth knew she was the embodiment of England. A weakened queen meant a trembling realm. She could not allow others to see her bedridden, for that image would spread panic. So, in her dark chamber, she chose to stand, to remain silent, as if guarding her own throne. The wind outside grew stronger, the damp of the stone walls mixing with the faint smell of incense. You inhale, and it feels as if you too are in that room, surrounded by anxious ladies in waiting to see if she will at last sit down. And in that moment you realize, this is not only a struggle with illness, it is a battle between willpower and the inevitability of nature. One important historical moment came in February of 1603, when her condition became undeniable. Advisors urged her again and again to name a successor, but she stubbornly shook her head. Even when Robert Cecil, the mastermind of her government, pressed her, Elizabeth only stared off into the distance. Some said she nodded faintly at the mention of James VI of Scotland, but she never declared it open. That ambiguity left the entire court holding its breath. From another angle, modern psychologists suggest her fear of death was tied to her youth. She had once been imprisoned, facing the threat of execution under her sister Mary I. The memory that death could strike at any moment must have carved itself deep into her mind. So, in her final days, when her strength drained away, that fear returned, driving her to reject even sleep. Think about it. If you go 2 or 3 nights without sleep, your mind begins to collapse. Elizabeth pushed herself for weeks. No wonder she grew frail, exhausted, sometimes speaking incoherently. Yet somehow she still carried herself with dignity, refusing to let anyone see her broken. It is both admirable and chilling, like someone clinging to a phone at 1% battery, refusing to charge. You know how it will end, but they stubbornly hold on anyway. The room grew quieter with each day. No more banquets, no more lute songs, no more poets' laughter. Only wind and whispered prayers remained. Records tell us she sometimes moved her lips, perhaps reciting prayers, perhaps murmuring a name. Some witnesses swore she whispered Essex in the night. That detail has always sparked debate. Did she truly call out the man who betrayed her, or was it the wishful invention of romantic courtiers? Historians remain divided. But the image of an old queen whispering in the dark the name of the man she condemned to death is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. At last, her strength failed. She could no longer stand. They placed her on cushions, pillows piled around her frail body. She sat, her eyes still fixed in that faraway stare, and you could feel it. She was not only struggling with death, but with herself. Her silence weighed heavier than words. A queen once praised for her speeches now chose absolute silence as her final act. If you find something almost ironic in this scene, you are not alone. A woman whose words once shook the entire court now refused to speak at all. It was like a famous influencer suddenly deciding never to post again, and her followers waiting endlessly for her return. And as you sit here in imagined darkness, listening to the wind slip through the cracks, you realize you are witnessing not just the death of a woman, but the closing of an age. Elizabeth's final days left behind not only a weary queen, but a lasting image in history of a woman who fought until the very end to preserve the appearance of power. You are sitting there in the imagined darkness of Richmond Palace, and the question echoes in your mind: what, in the end, killed Queen Elizabeth I? Her age knew nothing of blood tests, no microscopes, certainly no X-rays to reveal the hidden corners of the body. Court physicians could only speak of the imbalance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It sounds today like the menu of a detox juice bar, but back then it was the whole of 16th century medicine. Though the moment Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, rumors began to spread. People mourned their queen, yes, but they also wanted to decode what had brought her down. And you'd better be ready, because there are more theories than you might expect, and each one opens a new window into her life, her habits, and her obsessions. The first theory sounds simple: old age and natural decline. Nearly 70 years old in Tudor England was not the same as 70 today. Life expectancy then hovered around 35 to 40. Reaching 50 made you a walking miracle. Elizabeth lived almost to 70, far beyond the norm. Traditional historians say she simply died of exhaustion after 44 years on the throne. Imagine running a company for 44 years straight. No vacations, no retirement. Anyone would collapse. That explanation alone is convincing enough for many. But the story doesn't stop there. Another theory claims she died of pneumonia. Richmond Palace was damp, drafty, and cold. Elizabeth's habit of standing for hours without rest let the chill seep into her body. Soon her lungs gave way. Records mention her dry cough, shortness of breath, and fatigue, all classic symptoms. In those days, even a common cold could bury you, let alone pneumonia. Here's an eerie detail few mention. Richmond Palace stood right on the River Thames. That winter the river froze so solid people walked across the ice. Picture the cold seeping through stone walls, mixing with river air, turning her bedchamber into a giant freezer. Already weakened by fasting, she was no match for it. If you've ever tried sleeping in an unheated room during winter, you know how brutal that feels. The only difference is you can grab an electric blanket. Elizabeth had only silk layers and iron will. Still, the theory most repeated today is lead poisoning from cosmetics. Elizabeth was famous for her snow-white skin, but that look came from Venetian ceruse, a paste of white lead mixed with vinegar. She painted it on daily, year after year, until it became a mask. Anyone who's worn heavy Halloween makeup knows the suffocating feel. The problem is, lead seeps through the skin into the blood, slowly destroying the body. The symptoms of lead poisoning line up with her records: fatigue, depression, trembling hands, poor memory, ulcers, hair loss, teeth falling out. Witnesses said her teeth were black and sparse, forcing courtiers to politely ignore her smile. Imagine a proud queen hiding behind powder to preserve her image, while that very mask was killing her. Her power clung not only to her throne, but to her very skin, draining her life drop by drop. And here's the part that makes you smirk in the dark. If Venetian ceruse had a YouTube beauty review, it would get 0 stars. Flawless coverage, but side effect, slow death. Trust me, no one would add it to their cart. Historians still debate whether lead poisoning was the true cause. Some argue it only worsened her failing health. Others insist her mental decline, silence, anxiety, insomnia matches cases of heavy metal toxicity. But with no exhumation and no testing of her bones, the truth remains out of reach. The theory will forever stay in the realm of very possible. Another explanation points to dental infection. Elizabeth feared dentists, and who can blame her? 16th century dentistry had no anesthesia, no antibiotics. Every extraction was public torture. She let abscesses grow. Accounts describe rotting teeth, foul breath, and infections likely spreading into her bloodstream, leading to sepsis. In that era, once bacteria entered the blood, death was only a matter of time. One little known note: she once tried to attend a council meeting, but could not speak clearly from the pain in her mouth. Courtiers had to read her intentions from nods and glances. Imagine, the same queen who once thundered at Tilbury, now reduced to grimaces and gestures. Both tragic and strange. Here lies another scholarly argument. Some dismiss her dental issues as minor, while others call them the silent killer. With no autopsy and no medical records, the debate rages on, like a soccer match without a referee's whistle. Then comes a softer but compelling theory. Elizabeth died of sorrow and depression. Essex's death left a wound that never healed. She abandoned music, stopped conversations, and refused to write letters. To many, she showed the signs of deep clinical depression. And you know as well as I do, when the spirit breaks, the body follows. If a modern therapist had been at Richmond, she might have had counseling and sedatives. Instead, the Tudor prescription was prayer, herbs, and bloodletting. Hardly a cure for a collapsing mind. And yes, here's another place to smile. If social media had existed, the palace would have posted, "Her Majesty is offline for personal reasons." And people would whisper, "When's the comeback? Any new speeches?" This time, there would be no comeback. Looking back, you see that every theory has merit. Old age, pneumonia, lead poisoning, sepsis, even grief. Perhaps her death was not caused by one thing, but by all of them. A worn body, a heavy mind, and habits that turned against her. That is why her death remains a mystery. Unclear, untidy, veiled like the powder mask she wore all her life. Night falls, and Richmond Palace sinks into silence. Outside, the frozen Thames flows on, carrying away the rumors. Inside, her ladies in waiting look upon their frail queen and know, whatever the cause, this death is not just of a woman, but of a dynasty. And you sit there, listening, letting the whispers of history drift you slowly towards sleep. Picture this. When all the medical theories have been laid out, from pneumonia to lead poisoning, other whispers still drift through the cold corridors of Richmond. Some said Elizabeth did not die from illness, but from a choice. All her life, she resisted marriage, refused to let anyone share her throne, and in the end, she even refused the help of her physicians. Accounts tell us she would not allow anyone to touch her body, would not permit bleeding, surgery, or even a hand laid upon her pulse, as if, even in death, she demanded the final word of control. Here is the strange part. In Tudor times, many believed that sleep itself was a kind of temporary death, and Elizabeth, with her vivid imagination, may have feared that if she closed her eyes, her soul might never return. So she stood for hours, or sat rigid in her chair, while her body weakened. Think about it. If you pull an all-nighter today, you'll need double the coffee the next morning. Elizabeth had no Starbucks, only sheer willpower, and that willpower drove her faster toward death. Historians still argue, was this a kind of slow death by mental exhaustion, what modern medicine might call psychosomatic illness, or was it simply old age, hunger, and sleeplessness breaking down the body? No one has the final answer, and that ambiguity is what makes Elizabeth's death so unusual. It was not a sword stroke or a poisoned cup, but a mosaic of fragments, confusing, contradictory, impossible to piece into one clean story. And you know, some even whispered that the true cause was loneliness. All her life, Elizabeth chose to sit alone on the throne. No husband, no children. When the final moment drew near, no one could share that burden with her. You might call it a tragedy, or you might see it as the most consistent choice of all. She lived alone. That is why when you hear these theories, let your mind grow still. Whether it was pneumonia, poisoning, or sorrow, Elizabeth's death reflected her life, strong yet fragile, proud yet tragic. And though we may never agree on the cause, one thing is certain. Each theory shines light on a single corner, and together they form the most haunting mystery of a vanished age. Let your mind slow down, take a deep breath, and imagine. The funeral bells tolling over London in April 1603, deep and heavy, as if sinking the city into a fog of mourning. Crowds press against the cobbled streets, looking up at the black-draped carriage bearing the coffin of the queen who had ruled them for nearly half a century. And you realize at once, this is not only the funeral of a woman, it is the funeral of a symbol, an era, an identity that England had worn like a second skin for decades. The official history here is clear. Elizabeth's death marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. She was the last of her line. Immediately after, James VI of Scotland took the throne as James I of England, opening the Stuart era and beginning the union of the crowns between England and Scotland. Historians often describe this as a major political turning point, paving the way for a future united kingdom. But if you step into the minds of the people of the time, you see something different. They weren't thinking about diplomacy. They only knew she is gone, the only queen they had ever known in their lifetime. What few mention is how her funeral was staged. On top of the coffin lay a wax effigy, crafted with eerie precision. The powdered face, open eyes, ceremonial robes, the crown upon her head. People swore that the effigy's gaze followed their every step. In a society unaccustomed to lifelike portraiture, seeing a living Elizabeth atop her coffin was chilling. It was like sorcery. She was gone, yet present, watching, commanding, keeping the crowd from dissolving into chaos. Even in death, she performed. Historians still debate, should Elizabeth's legacy be praised without reservation or judged with sharper eyes? One side hails her as Gloriana, the glorious queen who defeated the Armada, protected England from invasion, and inspired a golden age of art and literature. Shakespeare, Spencer, Marlowe. The other side argues her reign was only good enough, that religious and economic tensions were never truly solved, only postponed, and later erupted into civil war under the Stuarts. You see, the debate is like an endless vote. Was Elizabeth the savior or merely the pollster? Even today, the answer shifts with perspective. Yet whatever scholars argue, ordinary people remember her image. That image was dazzling yet fragile. She appeared in heavy gowns embroidered with gold, her face masked with white lead powder, red wigs towering, pearl chains across her chest, an immortal queen, untouchable. But behind the mask was a body wasting away, a restless mind, a loneliness no one could share. Does that sound familiar? It's not unlike today's social media filters, perfect on the outside, turmoil within. In many ways, Elizabeth was history's first influencer, living inside an image she had built and guarded. And even in death, she protected that image. No final speech, no official heir named, no lament. Her silence became her most powerful statement. It was like a stage. The audience waited for her last line, but the curtain fell in silence, and that silence thundered louder than words. Picture thousands at her funeral, lining London streets. No wailing, no drums, only bowed heads, only silence. It was unlike any other royal funeral. Perhaps they sensed that Elizabeth wanted it so. All her life she wielded silence as a weapon. When she gave no answer, rivals were forced to guess. When she named no heir, the court was forced to hold steady. And by dying in silence, she forced an entire nation to reflect what truly remained after 44 years of rule. Another official detail: Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey, beside her half-sister Mary I. The sister who had once imprisoned her and nearly had her executed. On the tomb, an inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." If that strikes you as ironic, you're not mistaken. In life, they were bitter enemies. In death, they became eternal roommates. Imagine the afterlife conversation. Mary smirking, "I got the best spot in the Abbey, and you had to follow me here." For centuries after, the name Elizabeth came to mean not just a queen, but an age, the Elizabethan age. Poets, playwrights, musicians, explorers, all were stamped with her name. It's as if she herself became a unit of history. You don't say the late 16th century, you say Elizabeth's time. That is the power of a symbol, transcending flesh and politics to become an era etched into memory. Here's a lesser-known fact. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Elizabeth's image was repeatedly revived for politics. Under Queen Anne, she was called the New Elizabeth. During wars with France, statues of Elizabeth were raised, recalling her Tilbury speech. Even in the Victorian era, people compared Queen Victoria to Elizabeth to claim, "England is great only under strong queen." In other words, Elizabeth was not just the past, she was political ammunition for the future. And here's the twist, even her weakness and strange death became part of the brand. The story that she refused to lie down for fear of dying was retold as proof of her indomitable will. Perhaps it was only a personal obsession, but collective imagination transformed it into a legend. Here was a queen who never bowed. Even frailty became propaganda, and that is why she still lives, centuries later. Modern historians continue to argue, was Elizabeth truly great, or simply a master of image? Some say she excelled more at delay than decision, delaying marriage, delaying naming a successor, delaying reform. Yet that very art of delay gave England stability, and in a century of chaos, stability itself was a triumph. Sometimes, doing nothing is the perfect strategy. Like when you deliberately don't reply to a message, forcing the other side to wait and wonder. Elizabeth did that to all of Europe. And as you sit here, listening, your eyelids growing heavy, you realize the most unforgettable thing about Elizabeth is not her death, but the way she turned even death into part of the performance. A performance we, the audience, are still applauding hundreds of years later. Imagine this. As the candles in Westminster Abbey flicker out after Elizabeth's funeral, in the darker corners of history, people whisper of other deaths, the deaths that surrounded her, shaping her life and legacy. Because to truly understand Elizabeth's end, you must also hear the funeral symphony of her family, her friends, and her enemies. First, how could you forget Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's own mother? The official record is clear. In 1536, just 3 years after Elizabeth's birth, Anne was executed at the Tower of London for adultery and treason. They say she walked to the scaffold in a grey gown, head held high, and with one stroke of a French sword her life ended. For little Elizabeth, this was fate's first cruel cut. A mother lost, branded illegitimate, growing up in fear and uncertainty. Strange, isn't it? Anne died by the sword of a French executioner, considered a mercy, far quicker than the heavy English axe. Historians still debate. Did Henry VIII truly believe his wife guilty, or did he simply want Jane Seymour on the throne? Whatever the answer, Anne's death cast its shadow over Elizabeth, a mother who died for power and a daughter who would avoid marriage all her life, perhaps to escape the same fate. Then came Mary, Queen of Scots, both cousin and rival, a Catholic icon, imprisoned in English castles for nearly 20 years before Elizabeth finally signed her death warrant in 1587. That moment split history in two, Elizabeth as the strong queen defending her crown, but also as the woman trembling as she signed the execution of her own kin. Rumor has it she wept bitterly when she heard Mary was truly beheaded, as if she had only meant to threaten. But once the machine of politics moved, it could not be stopped. Historians still argue, was her grief sincere or a performance to soothe her conscience? Either way, Mary's bloody death remains one of the darkest stains of Elizabeth's reign. And how could anyone forget Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, the young man who once stirred the Queen's heart, then betrayed her in a clumsy rebellion in 1601. His end, the axe. Elizabeth's own signature sealed his death. They say that after his execution, her decline quickened. A little-known tale claims she kept a ring or a lock of Essex's hair in her chamber, perhaps as a token of guilt. Debate lingers, did she see him as a son, a lover, or merely a pawn? The truth is lost, but Essex's death was surely the final blow to her spirit. You see it now, around Elizabeth. Death marched like acts in a grim play, a mother beheaded, a half-sister Mary I dying in misery, a cousin Mary Stuart dying in shame, and a favorite Essex dying for treason. And then Elizabeth herself, dying in silence. No sword, no blood, no final words. Her quiet end stands out starkly against the violent deaths of those around her. Notice one more detail. Elizabeth often turned the deaths of others into instruments of her own politics. Her mother's death made her the survivor queen. Mary Stuart's death cemented Protestant power. Essex's death painted her as a ruler who spared no traitor, and her own death, silent, wordless, became the ultimate act, handing the stage to a new age. Modern historians still ask, was Elizabeth haunted by this cycle of death around her, or simply a product of a brutal era where thrones were bathed in blood? Some say she learned to weaponize tragedy, to turn loss into image. Others insist she truly feared it, which is why she shunned marriage and children. Knowing royal unions often ended at the scaffold. Whatever the case, the lesson is chilling. Power is not only a crown of jewels, but also the ghosts of those who died to keep it. And as you sit here, in the imagined dark, listening to history's whispers, you realize Elizabeth was not just a queen, but the center of a storm of tragedy. Around her, some died young, some in disgrace, some in loneliness, and against all that noise, her own silent death became a final, haunting note. A farewell both tragic and proud. Breathe slowly and imagine, as the funeral bells for Elizabeth fall silent, the air in the court shifts at once. No one can sit forever beside the velvet-draped coffin. An entire kingdom now faces the question, after Elizabeth, who comes next? And you know, this is not only about a throne, it is about the survival of the realm itself. The official record is clear. After Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, James VI of Scotland was summoned and became James I of England. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland rested on the same head. Historians call it the Union of the Crowns. For scholars, it was a turning point. Two kingdoms, enemies for centuries, now bound under one king. But for ordinary people in that moment, the whispers were simpler. She is gone, and now what? Here's a strange detail. Before Elizabeth drew her last breath, it said she only nodded faintly when courtiers mentioned James's name. No words, no signed decree, only a nod. Yet the entire kingdom treated it as royal will. Do you see? Even in her final moments, Elizabeth did what she always did best: leave others guessing, turning ambiguity into politics. Historians still debate this. Did she truly nod, or was it collective imagination, a convenient story to avoid civil war? No one knows, but that final ambiguity became her last signature. As soon as the funeral ended, Robert Cecil, powerful secretary, sent riders galloping north to Scotland. Horses thundered across meadows in spring rains, carrying news that would alter the island's history. Imagine it. A single sealed letter, tucked in a rider's coat, weighing more than 1,000 swords. When James VI became James I, the Stuart dynasty began. People called him the King of Peace, hoping he would bind two nations together and shield them from foreign threats. But for many in England, it felt strange. After nearly 50 years with a queen who had no husband, no children, no one sharing her power, they now had to grow accustomed to a man, a king with a wife, children, and an entire noisy Scottish court in tow. One curious story: when James entered London, crowds poured into the streets. They cheered, threw flowers, welcomed him, but beneath the joy lay sorrow. They weren't just greeting a new king, they were also mourning their old mother of England. Elizabeth had often called her people "my children," and now, those children had to live under a new household. Historians still ask, where does Elizabeth's legacy end and James's begin? Some say she left him a strong, stable England, a gift of foundations. Others argue she left him ticking time bombs, religious strife, financial burdens, political tensions. Both sides may be right. The truth lies somewhere between. And here you sit, listening slowly, and see the paradox. Elizabeth's death was not a full stop, but an ellipsis. It opened a new dynasty, yet made everyone look back on all she had done to keep chaos at bay. A deeply symbolic image remains, Elizabeth's coffin laid directly above that of Mary I in Westminster Abbey. Two sisters, one Catholic, one Protestant, once bitter enemies, now resting together. The tomb reads, "Partners in throne and grave." Not just an inscription, but a statement. The Tudor age was over, leaving behind both light and shadow, reconciliation and division. Even in burial, the message was political. From there, Elizabeth's echo lived on. People kept telling her stories. Shakespeare's plays still carried the aura of her age, and the image of the Virgin Queen became a standard for queens who followed. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Like a pop star whose albums sell long after their death. Elizabeth, in her way, stayed at the top of history's charts for centuries. But that echo was not just applause. It was also a warning. The Stuarts inherited her crown, but also her unsolved problems. Within decades, England slid into conflict, religious quarrels, financial strain, civil war. When Charles I lost his head, many looked back and sighed, if only Elizabeth were still alive. Now, as you hear this, your eyelids grow heavy. The story of Elizabeth, from her death to her legacy, is more than history. It is a whispered lesson. Power can hold a nation, but silence can shape an entire age. Elizabeth departed without a word, yet her silence still echoes, even now. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle into a steady rhythm, and imagine England in the days just after Elizabeth's death. The morning air had not yet lifted, but conversations were already spreading everywhere. From the cold corridors of Westminster to the smoky taverns along the Thames, everyone spoke of her. They whispered as if Elizabeth were still there, just standing behind a velvet curtain, watching with unblinking eyes. Ordinary people remembered her as the old mother of England. They told stories of her in shining silver armor at Tilbury, her voice ringing out before the troops, "I have the heart and stomach of a king." To them, it was not just a rallying cry. It was a memory of a time when England would not bow, a time they believed God stood on their side. Old men repeated it to children, and children sang mocking rhymes. "The old queen will not sleep." It sounds almost funny, but those little rhymes kept the memory alive. In the theaters, candlelight glowed against dark wooden beams. New plays by Shakespeare and his peers still carried Elizabeth's shadow. Strong yet lonely women in Measure for Measure or Othello bore traces of the departed queen's spirit. Art became the way society remembered her, part tribute, part collective therapy. Picture it. The audience sitting on wooden benches listening intently but seeing not just the characters on stage, but Elizabeth herself, seated somewhere in the darkness. Elsewhere, mystery spread. Astrologers whispered Elizabeth's death was only an appearance. They claimed she would return, or at least that her spirit lingered by the throne. Some swore that the gust of wind which greeted James's entry into London was Elizabeth herself testing the new king. To modern ears it sounds like clickbait, but in an age of omens, such talk traveled faster than any printed sheet. People nodded, half afraid, half comforted, believing their queen had not truly abandoned them. This fed a debate that never ended. How great was Elizabeth's spiritual legacy? One side said she simply closed the Tudor age, and England quickly moved on to the Stuarts. The other insisted the image of the Virgin Queen rooted itself so deeply in the national imagination that every queen after her would be measured against her. Both are right, for even as James Stuart sat firmly on the throne, people still called the age they had left behind Elizabethan. The monuments that rose later reflected this obsession. Statues did not just show a woman in grand gowns, but the very symbol of stability. Whenever people looked upon them, they saw something familiar. A woman standing firm, enduring every storm, then leaving in silence. And that silence, strangely enough, carried farther than any speech. Step deeper into the stories, and you hear the tragic chorus around Elizabeth. The whispers of Anne Boleyn, her beheaded mother, the cries of Mary Stuart, her executed cousin, the desperate plea of Essex before the axe. All of it merged into one mournful song. Yet it was Elizabeth's final silence that became the loudest note. Picture London that spring, cold winds sweeping the cobbled streets, carrying the smell of smoke and damp stone. Shops shuttered, people huddled, talking about her more than ever, as if to make up for her silence in the end. Each carried their own Elizabeth in memory, the warrior at Tilbury, the stern old mother, or the stubborn woman who would not sleep. This very multiplicity ensured she would never fade. Even in the new Stuart court, Elizabeth's shadow lingered. James I might sit on the throne, but constant comparisons haunted him. A male king with wife and children was a sharp contrast to the mysterious, unmarried woman his people had known for decades, and you can guess the reaction. Many sighed for the old reign, even as the new one began. Here's a little-known fact. Centuries later, in Victoria's time, Elizabeth was still called the prototype. Queen Victoria also reigned long and became a national symbol, yet in speeches Elizabeth's name was always mentioned first, the standard to follow. Proof that Elizabeth did not just belong to her own age, she lived on in the political and cultural imagination of later generations. And now, sitting here, you sense the paradox. Elizabeth's death was not an end, but the beginning of a legend. She died in silence, yet silence became her echo. People remembered her not only as a queen, but as an idea. Elizabethine, a word forever tied to glory, stability, and a touch of mystery. The London night stretches long, the wind moans past the windows, and you seem to hear echoes in the dark. Not fiery speeches, but silence sinking deep into bone. That is the after-sound Elizabeth left behind, a resonance that made the world whisper her name, even in sleep. You sit still, take a deep breath, and let your imagination drift back to London at the dawn of the 17th century, where Elizabeth's shadow still hangs like mist, and there is something strange you can't ignore. Sometimes, when a figure leaves this world, their influence only grows stronger. Elizabeth is the perfect example. After her death, what remained was not only a throne for James Stuart to inherit, but an entire ecosystem of memory that left England both comforted and haunted. Picture those first days of the Stuart court. In the great halls, Scottish nobles poured in with their own customs, accents, and ambitions, filling the London palaces. For the capital's people, long accustomed to Elizabeth's discipline and silence, the noise and roughness of the new court felt bewildering. So, for comparison, they returned to her name. People sighed. Under Elizabeth, things were more in order. You know the feeling. It's like when your favorite cafe changes hands, the new owner too loud, and you quietly miss the old quiet keeper. Official records note this. Soon after James I's coronation, a flood of printed plays, portraits, and poems praising Elizabeth appeared, not only in remembrance, but also as a reminder to the new king that he was inheriting a brand too powerful to ignore. Printers made fortunes selling her portraits, especially the famous images of Elizabeth in white gowns, orb and scepter in hand, the goddess of power etched into public memory. Strangely, people also kept coins bearing her face as lucky charms. Families whispered that Elizabeth's spirit still watched over them. Some even placed a coin under a child's pillow, hoping it would bring strength and wisdom. It was never officially sanctioned by the court, but the custom endured. Elizabeth had become a kind of popular culture icon, long before the term even existed. Modern historians still argue, was Elizabeth's legacy truly golden or largely embroidered by those who came after? Some say her stability was luck, foreign enemies weakened, allies at home too tired from religious wars. Others insist it was skill, knowing when to be firm, when to delay, and especially when to remain silent. Like a harpist plucking just the right string, Elizabeth struck the notes that kept harmony. The debate will never end, but the truth is clear enough. Her image was recreated for centuries, proof of her enduring grip on history. Look closer at cultural life then. After her death, playwrights and poets kept weaving her memory into their art. At the Globe Theatre, when candlelight flickered on the curtain, audiences could not help but see Elizabeth in the strong, complex women on stage. This was how society healed, turning memory into art, softening grief, transforming tragedy into a collective lullaby. There's another detail. In the early Stuart years, artists painted Elizabeth alongside Greek goddesses, Minerva, Diana, Astrea. They placed her within myth itself, declaring she was more than mortal. She was a symbol within the cosmos. You might call it posthumous PR, but it worked. Each time someone gazed at such a painting, they forgot the frail old woman of her final days and remembered instead the eternal goddess queen. Here, fact and myth merged. Records also recall the strange atmosphere of her funeral. As her coffin passed, the crowd stood in eerie silence. No wailing, no noise, only stillness. They said that silence itself was Elizabeth's last speech. She needed no words. The air spoke for her. Familiar, isn't it? Like the end of a concert, when the final note fades and the audience sits in silence holding on to the echo before applause. Generations later, politicians and writers kept using her image for their own purposes. In times of crisis, the Elizabethan age was invoked as an ideal. When Queen Victoria took the throne, newspapers compared her to Elizabeth, assuring the people that England is great only under strong queens. Elizabeth became not just a woman, but a template, an archetype summoned whenever inspiration was needed. Even her weaknesses were recycled into legend. The story of her refusing to lie down for fear of death could have been read as panic, but instead, posterity framed it as iron will. Even death had to wait. What was once despair became heroism. That is the power of collective memory. It chooses what to keep, what to forget. Scholars still ask today, have we over-idealized Elizabeth? Was she truly as wise as we imagine, or have later generations clung to her as a necessary myth? Either way, her name remains tied to a golden age. And in history, not everyone earns that privilege. The London night stretches on, wind from the Thames whistling through cracks, carrying the scent of salt and damp stone. If you listen closely, you almost hear the chorus, the voices of common folk praising their old mother, the voices of actors reciting lines, the voices of scholars debating. Together they form a strange harmony, part real, part imagined, and in that song the highest note is not the Armada's defeat, nor the Tilbury speech, but Elizabeth's silence at the end, silence still resonating. And you, sitting here in the quiet, may feel that silence drifting around you. Not threatening, not fearful, but like a heavy blanket wrapping you, carrying you from the world of story into the world of dreams. Elizabeth is gone, but her story and her silence remains, like history's lullaby, repeating softly until you close your eyes. Close your eyes for a moment, let your breath flow slowly, and picture London a few months after Elizabeth had been laid to rest. Life gradually returned to its routines, but her memory did not. On every street corner, in every small story, her name was still whispered, as if her death had been only the curtain falling at the end of one act, not the final line. Official records show the Stuart court busy consolidating power. James I wanted to prove himself a king of reconciliation, but the English were not yet accustomed to him. They whispered. Under Elizabeth, things were different, and those whispers fed her transformation into the standard against which every reign that followed would be measured. Even in distant countryside villages, people found ways to keep her image alive. In some towns, folk songs were sung praising the Virgin Queen, the protector against the Spanish Armada. They did not need to understand politics. To them, Elizabeth meant safety. Mothers sang lullabies with lines like, "The old mother guards her children until the moonlight fades." It was, in truth, a form of collective memory, quietly passed down outside the pages of books. Meanwhile, nobles used Elizabeth's memory as a political weapon. Some praised her to prove the Stuarts must continue her stability. Others criticized her legacy to justify new reforms. Modern historians still debate, was this praise genuine remembrance or a tool to sway public opinion? Likely, the truth lies somewhere in between. Picture noble halls filled with wine and laughter. A marquis taps his cup and says with a smirk, "Elizabeth could stay silent, yet all of Europe listened. Now the king speaks too much, and few care." The room erupts in nervous laughter, then falls quiet, wary of spies. Do you see? Elizabeth's memory lived not only among the common folk, but as political whispers in the elite halls. At the same time, art and literature carried her into eternity. Printers flooded the streets with collections of poems, comparing her to stars, to Diana, the moon goddess, to Astrea, the goddess of justice. One famous print showed her emerging from the clouds, scepter in hand, gaze cast downward, as if she had become divine. Families pasted such images in their homes as charms, and thus Elizabeth slipped from mortal into myth. Another curious note: farmers believed that praying at Elizabeth's statue would bless their harvest. Some even tucked scraps of cloth printed with her likeness into their barns to ward off pests. Of course, the church never endorsed these practices, but they endured quietly. You might smile. The queen who once defeated the Armada now kept weevils from the grain. Yet, in its own way, it proved the resilience of her symbol in daily life. Scholars disagree. Did Elizabeth truly become a goddess in the eyes of her people, or is this later exaggeration? Evidence suggests that even during her life, ceremonies already elevated her toward divinity. Dressed in white, lit by candles, cheered by the crowd, some argue it was deliberate strategy to sanctify her image. Others say it is lonely woman masking her flaws. By the way, her silent death only fed the myth. Had she been assassinated or died of a clear illness, her story might have ended neatly. But because the cause was ambiguous, each generation could embroider its own meaning. Even today, people still ask, did she die of lead, of sickness, or of sorrow? And that very question keeps her alive. Imagine a night in the early 17th century. Wind from the Thames whistles past thatched roofs. A storyteller sits by the fire telling children, "There was once a queen who would not sleep, for she feared death, and so she guarded England until her final breath." The children drift off, half frightened, half enchanted. And so Elizabeth became a bedtime story, slipping into the dreams of generations. At a deeper level, playwrights turned her death into metaphor. In the political dramas of the early Stuarts, female characters who died silently, without words, were often understood as echoes of Elizabeth. Audiences grasped the message. Silence can be stronger than any speech. And you see, that is history's second language, the language of metaphor. Step into a church in 1604, and you might see Elizabeth's image still glowing in stained glass, lit by sunlight. People bowed their heads in prayer, though they knew she was gone. The mingling of religious faith and political memory created a half-real, half-dreamlike presence, and strangely enough, that presence calmed England through its uneasy transition. Historians still ask, was Elizabeth truly a wise ruler or simply a master performer? The answer may be both. She was a pragmatic politician and a skilled image maker, and in death, the image proved stronger than the flesh. Think of her as an oil painting. The original strokes may fade, but the layers added afterward preserve her forever. And so, through the centuries, her story was retold. Each generation added a detail, removed a flaw, until Elizabeth became both real and imagined. The unclear death, the floating legacy, all fused into a background music that never stops. And here you sit, listening to the wind outside your own window, realizing Elizabeth never vanished, she only changed form. From woman to legend, from legend to symbol, and from symbol into part of the lullaby of history, carrying those who seek peace gently into sleep. Let yourself relax. Let your imagination drift back to the final years of the 16th century, when Elizabeth still sat upon the throne, but the shadow of time had begun to stretch long across her reign. This is a bridge of a story, one that helps us understand why her death became legend. Because to truly grasp that last silent moment at Richmond, you have to look back at the days when Elizabeth still shone like a sun about to set. By then, Elizabeth was already in her 60s, an extraordinary age in Tudor England. While most common folk barely reached 30 or 40, the Queen had become a symbol of longevity. Yet behind the grandeur stood a failing body. Contemporary accounts describe her teeth falling out, her breath foul, her hair thinned and disguised with red wigs, and her face covered with thick layers of white lead makeup. To some, she resembled a wax figure, splendid from afar, unsettling up close. And yet Elizabeth knew how to hold the stage. Each time she appeared before her subjects, she dressed in dazzling gowns, high ruffs concealing her thinning face, a peacock fan in hand, and her steps slow but commanding. One foreign envoy wrote home, "The Queen is like a moving golden statue. One dares not look too long, for fear her radiance might scorch the eyes." Lavish words, yes, but they revealed the truth. Elizabeth survived on image more than on health. In those later years, succession debates plagued the court. Elizabeth had never married, had no children, and constantly dodged the question, "After you, who?" Modern scholars call this her great strategy of delay. For the longer she left the answer vague, the longer she held absolute power. Each faction hoped the Queen would favor them, and in their waiting, she remained the center of gravity. Historians still argue, did Elizabeth truly refuse to name a successor because she feared losing power even while alive? Or did she in some sense view the throne as her one true husband and could never share it? Either way, her silence cast a shadow that lingered all the way to her final breath. Picture those festive seasons, Elizabeth stepping onto the palace balcony, the crowd below roaring her name. Their shouts thundered across the square, while behind the curtain, her counselors whispered, "When will she choose an heir?" That tension between the light of public celebration and the darkness of private doubt created an Elizabeth who was both radiant and terribly alone. There is an odd detail. In her later years, Elizabeth began collecting strange objects. Reports say she kept dolls dressed in miniature copies of her gowns, perhaps to see herself young again. Some suggest she used them to rehearse her image, each new gown tested on the doll first. Others speculate they were charms, protective talismans against death. Whatever the truth, the thought of a Queen of England fussing over dolls is both pitiful and haunting. But politically, her later years were anything but peaceful. England's failures in Ireland, the deaths of trusted generals, and above all, the Essex Rebellion of 1601, left deep wounds. Robert Devereux, once the bright spark of her twilight years, turned against her in a clumsy revolt. His execution was a crushing blow. Many said the Queen withered rapidly afterward, as though Essex's blood drained her spirit too. Among the people, darker tales spread. Some whispered that the ghost of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, haunted the palace corridors, reminding her daughter that crowns are always stained with blood. Others said Mary Stuart's spirit, executed by Elizabeth's order, roamed the night and stole her sleep. Superstitious or not, in an age that believed in omens, these tales thickened the air of dread. Even playwrights seemed to keep the mood alive. Shakespeare, living in the Queen's time, filled his works with stories of power, betrayal, and doomed women. Whether or not he aimed them at Elizabeth, audiences often saw her shadow behind the characters. Art and life blurred, turning Elizabeth into a living emblem long before her death. A modern historian once wrote, "Elizabeth did not die in 1603. She began dying years earlier, when her public image and private self grew so far apart they could no longer meet." A grim thought, but perhaps true. Her body weakened steadily, but her image, the goddess queen, the virgin monarch, only grew stronger. Her death at Richmond was merely the final act of a process long underway. Imagine her in those evenings at the palace window, staring at the sunset over the gardens, silent, her hand resting on old letters, her mind crowded with memories. Her mother beheaded, her sisters at odds, her lover turned traitor. These ghosts did not leave her. Perhaps that is why she stood for hours, refusing sleep. She was not only defying death, but also defying memory. More curious notes appear in her attendance journals. Elizabeth sometimes laughed to herself, as though speaking with invisible companions. Some believed she spoke to Essex's spirit, others thought she was comforting herself. But in a weary court already cloaked in gloom, such moments only deepened her aura of mystery. Scholars remain divided. Was Elizabeth in her last years a woman drifting into madness, or still a master of performance? Perhaps both. Her mind may have been frayed by age and sleeplessness, yet she still knew how to command the court with silence alone. That paradox, weak and strong, fragile yet unyielding, is what turned her death from an event into a legend. So before we move toward the ending, we pause here with this tapestry of fragments: failing health, the solitude of her palace, the ghosts of her past, and the art and politics that painted her into myth. Together they form a mournful melody, a story that does not simply end but lingers, slayered, haunting, unforgettable. Let your breath slow down, let your shoulders relax, and listen as the story comes to its end. The whispers of Elizabeth I have followed you through this long journey, from her final days, standing rigid in the cold chamber at Richmond, to the theories about her death, the ghosts of her mother, of Mary Stuart of Essex, and the echo of her legacy carried into the Stuart age. And now, all of it begins to fade into quiet. Picture her velvet-draped coffin resting in Westminster Abbey, placed above the grave of Mary I. Outside, time flows on. The Tudor dynasty has closed, and other reigns rise in its place. Yet one thing does not vanish: Elizabeth's silence still resonates. That silence is no longer the stubbornness of a woman refusing sleep, but a gentle reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only allowed to carry us into peace. Scholars may go on debating the cause of her death. Poets may keep turning her into a goddess in their verses, but you, in this moment, only need to let the soft telling drift you away. Like a candle in the old palace, flickering, then slowly fading, unhurried, without noise. If you feel your eyelids growing heavy, that is only natural. The cobbled streets of London are far behind, the funeral bells have quieted, and all that remains is your own heartbeat, steady and calm, like an eternal lullaby. Elizabeth has gone, but she leaves us with one lesson: silence can sometimes be the most powerful voice. And just like that, you can let silence now become your own lullaby. May you have a night of deep rest and gentle dreams. Let this story close here, like a velvet curtain falling at the end of a long play. Nothing more to hold, nothing more to explain. Only the slow rhythm of breath, the closing of your eyes, and peace moving through every part of you. Sleep well.